The Duke of Kestrel Chase offered Honora Vickers a purse heavy with gold. It was meant to be a kindness, a final settling of accounts for the widow of his late steward, a woman presumed to be left with next to nothing. Gideon Severn, a man whose life had been stripped of sentiment by war and loss, expected a quiet curtsy, perhaps a grateful tear he would find profoundly uncomfortable. He did not expect the woman standing before him in the decaying office of Heron Court, her hands clasped and her gaze unnervingly direct, to ignore the purse entirely. He did not expect her to say, in a voice as clear and steady as winter ice, "Your Grace, I am not seeking charity. I am here to make an offer to purchase the estate." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence broken only by the drip of a persistent leak in the ceiling and the scratching of a mouse behind the wainscoting. For a man of immense power and few words, Gideon Severn found himself, for the first time in a decade, utterly without a response. To understand how such a moment came to pass, one must look back 3 weeks to a small, damp cottage on the edge of the Heron Court lands. There, Honora Vickers lived in the shadow of her late husband's family. Her husband, Arthur, had been a gentle soul, a man more interested in birdsong than in ledgers, and he had been steward of the Duke's secondary and much neglected estate for 10 years. He had also been a man utterly governed by his mother, Maud Vickers. Upon Arthur's death from a sudden fever 6 months prior, that governance had transferred, with crushing weight, onto Honora. Maud, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched by disappointment, had moved her and her feckless second son, Frederick, into the principal rooms of the steward's house, relegating Honora to the status of an unpaid dependent. Honora's days were a litany of invisible labor. She was the one who rose before dawn to stoke the fires, who mended Frederick's shirts with stitches so fine they were invisible, who unpicked the snarled accounts of the family's failing wool-broking business in Marley, and who endured Maud's constant, dripping criticisms. Honora was too plain, too quiet, too barren, a fact Maud never failed to mention. A drain on the family's dwindling resources. "You brought nothing into this marriage, Honora, and it seems you shall take nothing out of it," Maud had said just that morning, watching as Honora carefully re-inked a quill. "It is by my good grace you have a roof over your head. You would do well to remember it." Honora did not reply. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Words changed nothing. The only things that had power were facts, figures, and the quiet endurance of a stone in a river. Her own small cottage, which she had insisted on retaining, was her only sanctuary. It was sparse but immaculate. In a locked wooden box beneath her bed, she kept 2 items of immense personal value. The first was a small, perfectly balanced ledger bound in dark green leather. In it, she had recorded every penny of the dowry her own grandmother had left her, a sum Maud believed had been spent years ago. Honora had not spent it. She had invested it, cautiously and wisely, through a solicitor in a distant city who knew her only as H. Vickers. The sum had grown. It was not a fortune, but it was substantial. It was hers. The second item was a sheaf of papers, her own notes on the workings of Heron Court. In the evenings of their marriage, when Arthur was tired of his mother's complaints, he would talk to Honora about the estate. Not about the finances, he was hopeless with those, but about the land itself. The way the water meadows flooded in April, the south-facing slope that was perfect for an orchard, the crumbling wall of the old priory, the tenant families who had worked the same fields for 200 years. Honora had listened, and she had remembered everything. The news of the Duke's impending arrival had sent the vicar's household into a frenzy. Gideon Severn, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, was a near mythical figure. He had inherited the title a decade ago, but had spent most of that time either at war or in a self-imposed exile at his primary seat, a fortress of granite and grief 100 miles to the north, following the death of his wife and infant son. He had never once set foot in Heron Court, leaving it to the stewardship of Arthur Vickers. Now he was coming. Maud's plan was simple and theatrical. She would dress in her finest mourning bombazine, weep gracefully, and petition the Duke for a generous pension in recognition of her son's loyal service. "He is a man of honor," she declared. "He will not see the widow and mother of his faithful steward cast out into the street." She spoke as if Honora were a piece of furniture to be included in the inventory of their shared misery. Honora knew better. She had seen the real ledgers, the ones Arthur had hidden in his shame. She knew the estate was not merely neglected, it was failing. Rents were uncollected, tenants were leaving, barns were collapsing. Arthur's loyal service had been a decade of benign mismanagement, accelerated into sharp decline by Frederick's petty pilfering for his gambling debts, all of it papered over with hopeful fiction. A man like the Duke of Kestrel Chase, a man forged in the brutal logic of a battlefield, would not be swayed by tears. He would be moved by facts, and the facts were ruinous. While Maud rehearsed her swoon and Frederick polished his boots, Honora walked the grounds of Heron Court alone. She felt the chill of the evening air, smelled the decay from the damp, clogged ditches, and saw not ruin, but potential. She saw the rich soil lying fallow, the sturdy bones of the house beneath the peeling paint and shattered panes. She thought of her small, growing capital. She thought of her knowledge. And she thought of a life of her own, free from the tyranny of Maud's small-minded cruelty. A desperate, audacious idea began to form. It was impossible. It was madness. And it was the only path she could see. When the Duke's carriage was spotted on the long, rutted drive, Maud positioned herself and Frederick in the grand, drafty entrance hall. Honora was not with them. She had slipped away to the steward's office, a place of organized chaos, and began to do the only thing she knew how. She began to put things in order. The Duke of Kestrel Chase was a taller man than Honora had imagined, broad-shouldered and severe. He moved with a heavy, deliberate economy, his face a mask of cold neutrality. He listened to Maud's preamble without a flicker of expression, his gaze sweeping over the dusty hall, the water stains on the ceiling, the general air of dereliction. He cut her off mid-sentence. "The ledgers," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of warmth. "Where are they?" Frederick, flustered, led him to the steward's office. The room was a disaster. Account books were piled haphazardly, papers spilled from drawers, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and mice. The Duke's lip curled in faint, controlled disgust. He dismissed Frederick and Maud with a curt nod, leaving them hovering in the hallway. And then he saw her. Honora was standing by the far window, a stack of disorganized invoices in her hands. She had not been trying to hide, merely to be unobtrusive. She wore a simple gray dress, patched at the elbow, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She was everything he had expected of a poor steward's widow. Plain, drab, forgettable. He picked up the topmost ledger from a teetering pile. It was for the year just past. He flipped it open. The entries were a mess of blotched ink and frantic, optimistic arithmetic that made no sense. "This is a fiction," he stated, not to her, but to the room. "Yes, Your Grace," a quiet voice replied. He looked up, surprised she had spoken. "You are Mrs. Vickers?" "I am, Your Grace. Honora Vickers." "You were aware of the state of these accounts?" It was a test, a trap. She could feign ignorance, blame her late husband, plead helplessness. Instead, she gave him the truth. "I was aware that my husband was not a man of figures. His strengths lay elsewhere." It was a small, dignified defense of the dead, and it cost her nothing. Gideon's gaze sharpened. He gestured to a column of figures. "This entry, for the sale of wool from the north pasture. It is recorded as profit, but the invoices for the shearers and the transport are not accounted for. A loss, then." "A significant loss, Your Grace," Honora confirmed. "The actual price received was a third less than what is recorded here. The buyer, a Mr. Finch, took advantage of my brother-in-law's inexperience. The true invoice is in the stack I am holding. It is dated the 5th of October. He watched her, his expression unreadable. She spoke of financial matters with the calm precision of a solicitor. He had expected hysterics from the mother and obsequiousness from the son. From this quiet woman, he was getting unvarnished data. He gestured to the chaotic room. "Can you make sense of this?" "I can, Your Grace. It will take time." "I do not have time. My solicitor will handle it. A new steward will be appointed." He paused, his eyes falling to the careful patch on her sleeve, the worn tips of her shoes. He saw a life of thankless toil. His next words were meant as a dismissal, an end to the whole sorry business. He reached into the coat pocket where the purse of coins rested, his duty as a landowner pricking at him. He led her from the office, past the still hovering Maud and Frederick, and into a small, empty parlor. He disliked performing charity before an audience. He pulled out the leather pouch. It clinked with the heavy promise of 50 gold sovereigns, more than enough for a woman like her to find a small, respectable life elsewhere. "Mrs. Vickers," he began, holding it out, "for your husband's service, this will see you settled." Honora looked at the purse, then at his face. She saw a man dispensing with an unpleasant duty. She saw a man who did not see her at all, only a category of person, a poor widow. And in that moment, her impossible, audacious idea became a necessity. She clasped her hands before her, her knuckles white. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low but carrying the force of absolute conviction, "I am not seeking charity." He frowned, his hand still outstretched. "I am here to make an offer to purchase the estate." And so, the silence fell. Gideon Severn stared at the woman. He looked at her worn dress, her work-roughened hands, and the impossible statement that hung in the air between them. He had dealt with kings and generals, with financiers and spies. He had never been so thoroughly wrong-footed in his life. He slowly withdrew his hand, the purse of gold suddenly feeling foolish and inadequate. "Explain," he said. It was not a request. It was a command. Honora took a steadying breath. This was the moment. All her quiet years of observation, of careful accounting, of suppressed ambition, culminated in this single, terrifying speech. Heron Court is not failing, Your Grace. It is being failed. The land is good. The tenants are hard-working, but their leases are unjust and their tools are broken. The house has strong bones, but it has been allowed to fall into neglect. She spoke with a passion that seemed at odds with her placid exterior. Your Grace means to sell it, I presume. You will sell it to the first bidder, likely Mr. Piers Sinclair, who has been circling it for a year. He will offer you a pittance, citing its derelict state. Then he will strip the woods, raise the rents, and sell the land off in parcels within 5 years. The community that has existed here for centuries will be broken. The house will be left a hollow shell. Gideon's expression remained impassive, but a flicker of something, interest perhaps, showed in his dark eyes. He had, in fact, received a preliminary offer from Sinclair just last month. "And you believe you can do better?" he asked, the question laced with skepticism. "I know I can," Honora said simply. She reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a small, folded piece of paper. It was not the green ledger. She was not so foolish as to reveal all her resources at once. It was a single sheet, a budget she had worked on for 3 nights straight. "I cannot offer you a lump sum to match Mr. Sinclair. I do not have that kind of capital. Not yet." She unfolded the paper. "But I have this. An initial investment of £500. She saw his eyebrow raise a fraction. It was a significant sum for a steward's widow. "It is my own. I propose to use it not for purchase, but for restoration. £100 to repair the main sluice gate in the water meadows, 50 to re-roof the primary tenant farm, 70 for new seed corn, 200 for wages for local men to repair the outbuildings and clear the ditches. The remaining 80 for lime and tools." She spoke without looking at her notes, her memory precise. "I am not asking you to give me the estate. I am proposing a partnership. Grant me custodianship of Heron Court for a period of 10 years. I will live in the house, and I will manage it. I will restore it to profitability within 3 years. From the profits, I will pay you a lease equivalent to the income you currently receive, which is next to nothing. The rest of the profits will be reinvested in the estate. At the end of 10 years, I will have the option to purchase Heron Court from you at a price we agree upon today, based on its current, dilapidated value." She finished, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had laid her entire plan, her entire soul, bare before this cold, powerful man. Gideon was silent for a long time. He walked to the grimy window and looked out at the overgrown lawns. What she proposed was unorthodox, almost laughably so. A woman, a steward's widow, managing a 1,000-acre estate? The county would be scandalized. And yet, it was the most sensible business proposal he had heard in years. It required no investment from him. It promised to rescue a dying asset. And it was presented not with feminine wiles or emotional pleas, but with figures and a clear-eyed strategy. He was a man who prized evidence above all else, and this woman had just presented him with a compelling case. He turned back to her. "You would live here? Alone?" "The current housekeeper, Hannah, would remain, I hope, and I would need staff." "My mother-in-law and her son will not be pleased," she added, a masterpiece of understatement. "They are no concern of mine," Gideon said dismissively. He thought of the alternative: selling to Sinclair, a man he instinctively disliked, or letting the estate rot completely. This was interesting. It was a gamble, but the stakes, for him, were low. For her, they were everything. That imbalance appealed to his sense of pragmatism. You will submit to a quarterly audit by my solicitor, he stated, and I will place a man of my own here, to oversee the grounds and report to me directly. Honora's heart gave a leap. It was not a no. Of course, Your Grace. My lawyers in London will draw up the contract. It will be ironclad. If you fail to meet the profit projections you have outlined after 3 years, the agreement is void, and you will vacate the premises immediately. Your initial investment will be forfeit. That is fair, she said, her voice not wavering. He gave a short, sharp nod. Very well, Mrs. Vickers. You have your arrangement. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He simply turned and walked from the room, leaving Honora standing alone in the dusty parlor, the owner of nothing but a verbal agreement that had just changed the entire course of her life. Outside, he found Maud and Frederick waiting, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. Your Grace, Maud began. Gideon did not break his stride. Mrs. Arthur Vickers is the new custodian of Heron Court, he said, addressing the empty air as he walked towards the front door. You will vacate the steward's house by the end of the week. He passed them without another glance, leaving 2 sputtering, outraged statues in his wake. As he stepped into his carriage, he allowed himself a single, uncharacteristic thought. The widow was either a fool or a genius. He was not yet sure which, but for the first time in a very long time, he was curious to find out. The week that followed was one of quiet, vicious warfare. Maud Vickers, upon absorbing the shock of the Duke's decree, unleashed a torrent of fury upon Honora. She accused her of witchcraft, of seducing the Duke, of plotting against her own husband's family. Frederick, pale and shaking, could only stammer about injustice and ingratitude. You think he will let you keep it? Maud shrieked, her face mottled with rage as Honora calmly packed her few belongings from the cottage. He is toying with you. He will take your money and cast you out, and you will have deserved it for your treachery. Honora said nothing. She folded her last chemise and placed it in her trunk. Her silence was more infuriating to Maud than any argument could have been. On the final day, as the vicar's cart was being loaded with their possessions, Maud made one last stand in the doorway of the steward's house. You will regret this, Honora. You will die here alone, in that cold, empty mausoleum. No one will help you. No one. Honora simply looked at her. Goodbye, Maud, she said, and closed the door of her cottage for the last time. She did not watch them go. Moving into the main house of Heron Court was like stepping into the belly of a sleeping giant. Dust lay thick as velvet on every surface. The air was stale and cold, heavy with the scent of damp and decay. In the great hall, faded tapestries hung in tatters, and the furniture was shrouded in ghostly white cloths. It was not a home. It was a tomb. The housekeeper, Hannah, greeted her with undisguised hostility. Hannah was a thin, wiry woman who had served the estate for 40 years, first under the Duke's father, then under Arthur. She had been loyal to Maud. The Duke's man is here, she announced, her arms crossed tightly. Waiting in the kitchen. Name of Wilf. She did not call Honora ma'am or Mrs. Vickers. She used no title at all. Honora found Wilf in the vast, stone-flagged kitchen. He was a block of a man, with a weathered face and hands like shovels. He was drinking ale from a pewter tankard and said nothing as she entered, merely watching her from under bushy gray brows. He was the Duke's spy. Mr. Wilf, Honora said, her tone even. I am Honora Vickers. I trust the Duke explained my role here? He did, Wilf grunted. Said you think you can turn a profit from this wreck. Said I'm to watch you do it. Or watch you fail. I will require your help with the grounds, Honora continued, ignoring the challenge. "Tomorrow, we will start with the main sluice gate. I have the funds to hire 4 men from the village." Wilf grunted again, a sound of profound skepticism. "Them gates ain't been opened in 5 years, seized solid with rust." "Then we will need oil and leverage," Honora replied calmly. "Please, see to it." She left him there and began her own work. She did not start by giving orders to Hannah. She knew that would be useless. Instead, she tied on her apron, filled a bucket with water from the pump in the scullery, found a bar of lye soap, and began to scrub the floor of the kitchen. On her hands and knees, she worked her way across the grimy flagstones, one square at a time. Hannah watched her for a full hour, her expression a mask of disbelief. An hour later, as Honora's back ached and her knuckles were raw, Hannah appeared at her side with a second bucket of hot water. "You'll ruin your hands," the housekeeper muttered, setting it down. It was not an offer of help, but it was not outright obstruction either. It was the first crack in the wall of ice. Over the next weeks, a new rhythm established itself at Heron Court. Honora rose with the sun and worked until long after it had set. Her days were a blur of physical labor and mental calculation. In the mornings, she was outdoors with Wilf and the hired men, directing the clearing of ditches and the repair of fences. She did not simply point and command. She learned the names of the men, brought them bread and cheese at midday, and listened to their advice. Wilf's reports to the Duke, sent weekly by courier, began to shift from dismissive to grudgingly factual. "The widow had the sluice gate working, water meadows drained, hired Tom Fletcher's boys to shore up the north barn. She paid them on time." In the afternoons, Honora moved inside. She attacked the house room by room. She beat carpets until clouds of dust choked the air, polished tarnished silver until it gleamed with a ghostly light, and mended linens with the same meticulous stitches she had once used on Frederick's shirts. Hannah began to work alongside her, their movements slowly synchronizing in a silent partnership. One day, Honora came down to the kitchen to find the scent of baking bread filling the air for the first time. Hannah had fired up the great oven. It was a victory more significant than any repaired roof. The evenings were for the ledgers. In the steward's office, now clean and organized, she lit a single candle and began the painstaking work of unraveling years of financial chaos. She created a new set of books, her dark green ledger serving as the master copy. Every penny of her own capital was accounted for, every wage paid, every nail purchased. It was a testament of ink and paper, a fortress of facts against the world's doubt. Her first true test came not from the house or the land, but from the people. She began visiting the tenant farmers. The first was a man named Corbett, whose family had farmed their patch of Heron Court for generations. He was a grim, suspicious man whose fences were broken and whose children were shoeless. "The old steward promised us new seed 2 years running," he said, spitting on the ground. "We saw none of it. The rent's too high for this tired soil." Honora did not make promises. She walked his fields with him, listening as he pointed out the waterlogged patches and the blight on his potatoes. She looked at his worn-out plow. "The rent is not fair," she agreed. "I am drawing up new leases for all tenants. The rent will be a percentage of your yield, not a fixed sum. When the estate prospers, we all prosper. Next week, a delivery of new seed corn will arrive for you, and Mr. Wilf will bring you the draft horse from the stable to help with your plowing." Corbett stared at her, his suspicion warring with a nascent hope. "No one's ever offered that before." "It is not an offer," Honora said. "It is how we will now do business." Word of the new leases and the fair terms spread through the tenant farms like wildfire. For the first time in a decade, a fragile optimism began to take root in the soil of Heron Court. 2 months after her arrival, the Duke came to call. His arrival was unannounced. Honora was in the walled garden, a space that had been choked with thorns and nettles, her hands deep in the dirt as she struggled to free a dormant rosebush. She heard the crunch of boots on the gravel path and looked up to see him standing there, watching her. He was dressed in riding clothes, his severe face shadowed by the brim of his hat. She rose slowly, wiping her soiled hands on her apron. "Your Grace, I did not expect you." His eyes swept over the garden, noting the cleared beds, the neatly stacked piles of weeds, the tender green shoots of herbs she had planted near the kitchen door. He then looked at her, at the streak of dirt on her cheek and the weariness in her posture, a weariness belied by the determined set of her jaw. "I was passing through Marley," he said, which was a lie. He had ridden 30 miles out of his way. "Wilf's reports are concise. I wished to see for myself." She led him into the house. The great hall was no longer a tomb. The air was fresh, the floors shone with beeswax, and a vase of late-blooming chrysanthemums stood on a polished table. From the kitchen came the scent of roasting meat. Hannah appeared in the doorway and gave a stiff, correct curtsy to the Duke, her expression neutral, but no longer hostile. They went to the office. Honora opened her new ledgers. She did not wait for him to ask. "The first quarter's profits are modest, as expected," she began, her finger tracing a line of neat black ink. "But we are no longer operating at a loss. The tenant rents for this period are up by 15%, a direct result of the new lease terms. The initial repairs are complete, under budget by £12.04. The forecast for the spring planting is strong." Gideon listened, his gaze fixed on the ledger. The clarity, the precision. It was beautiful. It was a language he understood better than any other. He compared it to the chaotic scrawls of the old books, and the contrast was profound. This was not just accounting. It was restoration. It was sanity imposed upon chaos. He looked up from the book and met her eyes. "You have done well, Mrs. Vickers." It was simple praise, delivered in his usual clipped tone, but for Honora, it felt like the sun breaking through clouds. "There is much yet to do, Your Grace." Indeed. He stood to leave. He was a man uncomfortable with lingering, but he paused at the door. "The garden," he said. "My mother had a fondness for roses." It was the first personal detail he had ever shared. "I hope to have them blooming by June," she replied softly. He nodded once, then was gone. Honora stood in the quiet office, the scent of beeswax and old paper mingling in the air. She felt a strange sense of connection to the cold, distant Duke, a bond forged not of sentiment, but of shared purpose and mutual, unspoken respect. She had purchased not an estate, but a chance, and for now, it was enough. From the perspective of Gideon Severn, Duke of Kestrel Chase, the world was a series of problems to be solved or endured. His wife's death, followed so swiftly by his son's, had been a problem with no solution, and so he had chosen to endure it by sealing off the part of him that could feel. War had been a problem to be solved with logistics, strategy, and a necessary ruthlessness. His vast inheritance, with its dozens of properties and thousands of dependents, was a sprawling, unending problem he managed with cold efficiency from his ancestral seat at Kestrel Chase. Kestrel Chase was a masterpiece of order. Its granite walls were immaculate, its servants moved like ghosts, and its halls echoed with a profound and perfect silence. It was less a home than a monument to his own tightly controlled grief. He had thought this was how he liked it. He had thought the silence was peace. Then he had visited Heron Court. Riding back through the crisp autumn air, the image of the place stayed with him. It was not the polished floors or the balanced ledgers that occupied his thoughts. It was the smell of baking bread. It was the sight of the housekeeper, a woman his agent had described as curdled, performing a correct curtsy. It was the sound of men's voices, rough and good-natured, calling to each other as they mended a wall. It was the vibrant, determined life that Honora Vickers was coaxing from the brink of death. He returned to the silence of Kestrel Chase, and for the first time it felt empty, sterile. He sat in his cavernous library, a room containing 10,000 pristine volumes, and thought of her small office, with its single candle and its neatly stacked papers. He ate his solitary dinner, served by a footman who never met his eye, and thought of Honora in her dirt-streaked apron, speaking of roses. It was not pity he felt for her. He had offered her pity in the form of a bag of coins, and she had rejected it with a dignity that had stunned him. No, what he felt was something harder, something he had not felt for anyone in a very long time. It was respect. He respected her courage, her intelligence, her sheer, unyielding competence. She had not asked for help. She had presented a plan. She had not wept. She had worked. He unlocked a drawer in his desk and took out the file on Heron Court. He read Wilf's early reports, the ones full of skepticism. The widow thinks she knows farming. We'll see. Then he read the later ones. Met with the tenants, new leases. They seemed content. And the most recent one. Repairs holding. House is clean. She works too hard. That last sentence, a rare sliver of personal observation from a man as taciturn as Wilf, struck him. He spread her proposal, the single sheet of paper, on his desk beside a formal offer from Piers Sinclair. Sinclair's offer was slick, legally sound, and predatory. He wrote of maximizing assets and liquidating unproductive elements. He would turn Heron Court into coin and leave the husk behind. Honora Vickers spoke of sluice gates, seed corn, and fair leases. She was trying to make something whole again. Gideon looked around his silent, perfect library. He had spent years building these walls around himself, and he had become a prisoner within them. He thought of Honora Vickers, alone in that rambling, decaying house, fighting a battle on a dozen fronts, against rot, against rust, against the bitterness of her in-laws and the skepticism of her neighbors. She was rebuilding a home. He had forgotten what that word even meant. He found himself inventing reasons to be in the vicinity of Marley. He needed to inspect a quarry he owned nearby. He had to consult with a horse breeder 10 miles past the town. They were flimsy excuses, and he knew it. He was drawn back to Heron Court not as a duke inspecting his property, but as a man drawn to a single, steady flame in a world of darkness. He had offered her a transactional arrangement, but as he rode towards the estate for the second time, he was forced to admit to himself that his interest was no longer merely transactional. It was personal. The burgeoning success of Heron Court did not go unnoticed. In the nearby town of Marley, it became a subject of intense and often malicious gossip. The source of this gossip was a small, bitter woman, now living in cramped, rented rooms above a draper's shop. Maud Vickers. Robbed of her position and her imagined pension, Maud's fury had curdled into a poisonous resentment. She held court with the town's gossips, painting a lurid picture of events. Honora, she claimed, had bewitched the Duke. She was his mistress, installed in the house for his pleasure. The money she was spending was not her own, but his, a reward for her services. A woman like that, with no family, no beauty, no fortune, Maud would say, her voice dripping with false pity. How else could she have managed it? The Duke is a lonely man, after all, and she is a cunning, shameless creature. These rumors found fertile ground, particularly among the local gentry who had hoped to see Heron Court broken up and sold for parts. Chief among them was Piers Sinclair. Sinclair was a handsome, charming man with a polished veneer that concealed a core of ruthless ambition. He had considered Heron Court his for the taking, and was incensed that a plain, penniless widow had thwarted him. He saw Maud's bitterness as a useful tool. He began to call on Maud and Frederick, bringing them small gifts, listening sympathetically to their tale of woe. "It is a gross injustice," he would say, his voice smooth as velvet. "A woman of your standing, Mrs. Vickers, forced into these circumstances. And for what? So that woman can play the grand lady in a house that is not hers?" Under Sinclair's subtle cultivation, Maud's gossip grew more pointed, and Frederick, weak and resentful, became Sinclair's pawn. The social consequences for Honora were swift and cruel. When she went into Marley for supplies, shopkeepers who had once been friendly were now cool and distant. The butcher gave her the worst cuts of meat. The baker's wife served others before her, leaving her to wait. She was being quietly, methodically ostracized. Invitations to the modest social gatherings of the neighborhood, which would have been extended as a courtesy to the manager of the estate, never arrived. At church on Sunday, the other families in the gentry pews would turn their shoulders, creating a small, invisible wall around her. Honora felt their judgment like a physical chill. She was alone, just as Maud had predicted. The opposition soon escalated from social snubs to active sabotage. One night, the smell of smoke woke her. The small barn on the Fletcher farm, the one she had just paid to have re-roofed, was on fire. By the time they got the blaze under control, half the new roof was gone, and a quarter of the winter hay was destroyed. Wilf found a pile of oil-soaked rags tucked behind a loose board. It was arson. A few weeks later, a crucial document vanished from her office: the signed lease agreement for the Corbett farm. Without it, the new terms were unenforceable. Honora knew she had placed it in the top drawer of her desk. Now it was gone. She didn't have to guess who had a key. Frederick had grown up in the steward's house. She felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. This was an attack not just on her, but on the fragile trust she had built. She had no proof, only suspicions. To accuse her brother-in-law without evidence would make her look hysterical and vindictive. She had to absorb the losses, redouble her efforts, and show no weakness. It was into this tense, hostile atmosphere that the Duke returned. He found her not in the garden this time, but in the office, late at night, poring over the ledgers under the weary light of a single lamp. There were new lines of strain around her eyes. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He had heard the rumors in Marley. His solicitor had written to him, expressing grave concern about the whispers connecting the Duke's name with that of his new steward. "There is talk in the town," he said, his voice flat. "They say you are my mistress." Honora looked up from her work. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She did not flinch or blush. She simply held his gaze. This was another test, the most important one yet. Her reputation, the very foundation of her authority, rested on his belief. "Is it true?" he asked. The question was brutal in its directness. She could see the calculus in his eyes. He was a man whose name and rank were paramount. A scandal would be an inconvenience he would not tolerate. He was giving her a chance to confess, to allow him to quietly end their arrangement and sweep the whole affair under the carpet. "No, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is not." He searched her face for a long, silent moment. He saw no deceit, no fear, only a deep, weary honesty. He saw a woman being ground down by malice, yet refusing to break. He had built his life on evidence, and the evidence of her character was standing right before him. He gave a single, decisive nod.
"I did not believe it was."
The relief that washed over Honora was so profound, it almost buckled her knees. He believed her. In the face of gossip and slander, his trust was a shield. "They are trying to ruin me," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "The fire, the stolen lease. I have no proof, but I know it is my brother-in-law, Frederick, and his mother. They are being encouraged by Piers Sinclair." "Sinclair," Gideon said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "He wanted the estate." "He still does." Gideon's jaw tightened. This was no longer just a matter of a provincial estate's profitability. It was an attack on his judgment. It was an attack on a person he had chosen to place his trust in. The cold neutrality he had cultivated for years began to burn away, replaced by a hot, protective anger. "They have underestimated you, Mrs. Vickers," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "And they have made a grave error in underestimating me." He was no longer a passive observer. He was now a participant. The game had changed. He would not let her fight this battle alone. Piers Sinclair, emboldened by the success of his campaign of petty sabotage, decided it was time for a decisive blow. Gossip and social exclusion were effective, but they were slow. He needed to sever the link between Honora and the Duke, and he knew the Duke's weakness: his reliance on evidence. Sinclair resolved to manufacture it. His tool was Frederick Vickers. He found the weak, resentful young man in a tavern in Marley, drowning his failures in cheap gin. Sinclair laid out his plan with persuasive charm. It was not truly a crime, he explained. It was simply correcting the record. They would create a document that showed Honora for what she truly was: a thief. Under Sinclair's careful instruction, Frederick, who had a talent for mimicry, spent days practicing Honora's neat, precise handwriting. They obtained a blank ledger book of the same make she used. Their masterstroke was to create a single, damning page. It would show a series of withdrawals from the estate's account, small sums at first, then larger ones, all transferred to a fictional trading company in a distant port, a company for which Sinclair had already created a paper trail. It was a meticulous, clever forgery. One moonless night, while Honora was exhausted in a deep sleep, Frederick used his old key to slip into Heron Court. He moved silently through the familiar hallways to the office. With trembling hands, he carefully unstitched the binding of Honora's primary profit and loss ledger, inserted the forged page, and stitched it back together. It was a near-perfect crime. He was out of the house in less than 10 minutes. The next morning, an anonymous but concerned letter, penned by Sinclair, arrived at the London offices of the Duke's solicitor. The letter spoke of troubling rumours of embezzlement at Heron Court and urged the Duke's representatives to conduct a surprise audit for their own protection. The solicitor, Mr. Jardine, was a man of immense caution. He could not ignore such a direct accusation, especially when it was tied to the gossip already swirling around the Duke's name. He wrote to Gideon at once,
And then, without waiting for a reply, he took a coach to Marley. Gideon arrived at Heron Court a day later, his face set like granite. He had Jardine's letter in his pocket and a cold dread in his heart. He found Honora in the laundry, overseeing the mending of the estate's linens. She looked up when he entered, a smile touching her lips for a brief moment, before she saw the look on his face. "Mr. Jardine, my solicitor, is in Marley," Gideon said without preamble. "He has received an accusation against you. Of embezzlement." Honora felt the blood drain from her face. "That is impossible." "He insists on a full audit, immediately." Together they went to the office. The room felt cold, hostile.
Gideon stood by the window, his back to her, as Honora took out the ledgers. Her hands were steady, her conscience clear. She opened the profit and loss book, the one she had poured her life into for months. She turned the pages, explaining the entries, her voice gaining confidence as she detailed the estate's slow, steady climb to health. And then she saw it. A page that did not belong. The ink was subtly wrong, a shade blacker than her own faded walnut ink. The numbers were hers, mimicked perfectly, but the story they told was a lie. Withdrawals, fictitious shipping costs, payments to a company she had never heard of. It showed a deficit of over £200, all of it funneled away. "I see," Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet. He had turned from the window and was looking at the page over her shoulder. The evidence was right there, in black and white. It was in her book, in what looked like her hand. For a man who had been betrayed before, for a man who trusted paper more than people, it was a devastating blow. The trust he had placed in her, a trust that had begun to feel like something more, felt like a fool's wager. "Explain this," he commanded. The warmth that had begun to grow between them vanished, replaced by the icy wall of his authority. This was the crisis, the moment of doubt. Her entire future, her name, her home, all rested on this one forged piece of paper. A part of her wanted to weep, to protest, to rail against the injustice. But she had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She drew on her reserves of quiet control. She did not look at him. She looked at the evidence. Her precise, photographic memory began to work. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to analyze. She was not a weeping victim. She was an accountant, and this was a puzzle. "This is not my work," she said, her voice low and even. She pointed a steady finger at the page. "First, the ink. It is too new. It has not had time to fade as the other pages have. Look at the entry from the day before. You can see the difference." Gideon bent closer, his skepticism a palpable force. He could see a subtle variation, but it could be explained. "Second," Honora continued, her confidence growing as she found her footing on the solid ground of fact. "The ruling. I rule my own pages. I use a straight edge made of pear wood. It has a tiny nick in it, here, on the right side. It leaves an almost invisible imperfection in every line. That imperfection is missing from these lines." She traced the faint, familiar flaw on the preceding page, then showed its absence on the forgery. Gideon said nothing, but he was listening. "And third," she said, delivering the final, irrefutable point. "This entry. For a withdrawal of £50. It is dated the 14th of November. That was a Sunday." She finally lifted her eyes to his. "Your Grace, you yourself have visited on a Sunday. You know I do not do accounts on that day. It is the one day I reserve for the garden. Wilf knows it. Hannah knows it. You know it." The office was silent. Gideon looked from the damning ledger page to her face. He saw no cunning, no desperation. He saw the absolute, unshakable certainty of the truth. He saw the woman who had spoken of roses, the woman who had scrubbed floors on her knees, the woman who had faced down arson and slander without flinching. He had built his life on evidence. The paper in front of him was the woman before him was another. For the first time, he chose to trust the person over the paper. The doubt in his heart did not just fracture, it shattered. "Someone put it there," he said. It was not a question. It was a conclusion. "Frederick," she whispered. "For Piers Sinclair." Gideon reached out and closed the ledger. The case was closed. His trust in her, tested by fire, had been forged into something unbreakable. "Mr. Jardine is a thorough man," he said, a new, cold anger in his voice.
Let us give him an audit he will never forget.
He was no longer on the defensive. He was on the attack. Gideon Severn moved with the swift, cold precision of a general planning a campaign. He was no longer merely the landlord of Heron Court. He was its champion, and by extension, Honora's. The attack on her was an attack on him, and he would answer it not with quiet dismissal, but with public annihilation. "They used a public lie to wound you," he told Honora in the quiet of the office. "We will use a public truth to destroy them." His plan was simple and elegant in its cruelty. He would host a formal dinner at Heron Court. It would be the first grand social event the house had seen in over a decade. The pretext was to celebrate the estate's remarkable turnaround, a feast to honor its renewed prosperity. The true purpose was to set a stage. The invitations were sent. The entire local gentry was included, all the people who had snubbed and whispered about Honora. And, most importantly, specific formal invitations were dispatched to Mr. Piers Sinclair and to Mrs. Maud Vickers and her son, Mr. Frederick Vickers. To refuse would be a public admission of cowardice. They would have to attend. Gideon also sent a personal note to Lady Theodosia Carmichael, a dowager countess from a neighboring county. She was his godmother, a woman with a tongue as sharp as a razor and a mind that could dissect a man's character in under a minute. Her presence would lend immense weight to the proceedings. The week before the dinner, Heron Court was a hive of activity. Silver was polished to a blinding shine, floors were waxed until they reflected the candlelight, and the tattered tapestries in the great hall were carefully taken down and replaced with rich, dark green velvet hangings Gideon had sent from Kestrel Chase. Hannah, now Honora's staunchest ally, marshaled a team of temporary staff from the village, her voice ringing with an authority she had not used in years. The house, once a tomb, was coming alive, breathing in anticipation. Honora, for her part, felt a deep sense of nervous dread. She was to be the hostess of this grand affair, the lady of a manor that was not truly hers, presiding over a gathering of people who despised her. She confided her fears to Gideon. "I have no dress for such an occasion," she said simply. "I have nothing but my work clothes and my Sunday grey." The next day, a dressmaker arrived from the city, sent by the Duke. She brought with her bolts of silk in deep shades of bronze and emerald. His Grace's instructions were for something dignified and elegant, the color of a forest in autumn, the woman explained. Honora, who had never worn silk in her life, stood numbly as she was measured and pinned. The night of the dinner arrived. The long drive to Heron Court was lit with lanterns, and a stream of carriages crunched on the freshly raked gravel. Honora stood beside Gideon in the great hall to receive their guests. She wore the bronze silk gown. It was simple in its cut, unadorned with lace or jewels, but it flowed around her with a quiet grace. For the first time, she did not look like a steward's widow. She looked like the mistress of the house. Piers Sinclair arrived with a confident smile, his handsome face radiating charm. He bowed low over Honora's hand, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Mrs. Vickers, you have worked wonders with the old place," he said, his tone implying she was merely the temporary help. Maud and Frederick Vickers were among the last to arrive. Maud was dressed in a gaudy purple satin, her face a mask of sour triumph. She believed this dinner was the prelude to Honora's public disgrace. Frederick looked pale and sick, his eyes darting nervously around the gleaming hall. The dinner itself was a masterpiece. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation hummed. Honora found her footing, speaking quietly with her guests about the estate, her knowledge and passion evident. Lady Theodosia Carmichael watched the entire scene with hooded, intelligent eyes, saying little, but seeing everything. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared, Gideon rose from his seat at the head of the table. A hush fell over the room. "I would like to thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and resonant. "As you know, I invited you here to celebrate the remarkable revival of Heron Court under the custodianship of Mrs. Vickers." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled faces. "However, I also had a second purpose: to conclude a matter of business." He looked directly at Piers Sinclair. "As some of you may be aware, a serious accusation was made against Mrs. Vickers, an accusation of embezzlement. My solicitor, Mr. Jardine, conducted a full and thorough audit of the estate's accounts." Maud Vickers leaned forward, a grim smile playing on her lips. Sinclair took a sip of his wine, the picture of nonchalance. "The audit did indeed find something," Gideon continued. "It found a forgery." A gasp went through the room. A single page, expertly inserted into the estate ledger, designed to make an honest woman look like a thief. Gideon then proceeded, with cold, methodical clarity, to lay out the evidence, just as Honora had shown him. He spoke of the different ink, the flawed ruling on the page, and the final, fatal error. The forgery contained an entry for a day when Mrs. Vickers famously does not work, he said. A Sunday she spends in her garden. A fact known to anyone who has spent any time here. He then gestured to a quiet man standing near the door, whom no one had noticed before. "This is Mr. Ames, a handwriting expert from London. He has examined the ledger. He has confirmed that while the hand is a clever imitation, it is not Mrs. Vickers. He has also confirmed that the ink is less than a month old." The room was utterly silent. Sinclair's smile had frozen on his face. Maud's triumphant expression had collapsed into confusion. Gideon's gaze now moved to Frederick Vickers. His voice softened, losing its hard edge. He did not accuse. He invited. "Mr. Vickers," he said gently, "a man can be made to do things he regrets, under pressure from those with stronger wills. A man can make a mistake, and if he is a man of honor, he can correct it. Tell me, Mr. Vickers, who gave you the forged page?" It was a lifeline, a chance for the weak, terrified Frederick to save himself. All eyes in the room turned to him. He looked at his mother's furious face, then at Sinclair's cold, warning glare. He began to tremble violently. The pressure was too much. He broke. "He made me do it!" Frederick cried out, pointing a shaking finger at Sinclair. He said it would put things right. He showed me how to copy her hand. And Mother knew! She encouraged it!" The confession hung in the air, absolute and damning. The public reckoning was complete. Piers Sinclair stood up, his face white with fury. "This is an outrage! The boy is hysterical!" But it was too late. Lady Theodosia Carmichael chose that moment to speak, her voice cutting through the chaos like a shard of glass. "I have always found, Mr. Sinclair," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "that a man's character is revealed not by his ambitions, but by the tools he uses to achieve them. Yours, it would seem, are cheap and shoddy." It was a social execution. The guests erupted in a cacophony of shocked whispers. Sinclair, his reputation shattered in a single sentence, turned and fled the room. Maud Vickers sat as if turned to stone, her face a ruin of public humiliation. Honora's vindication was absolute, witnessed by the very people who had condemned her. She had won. The guests departed in a flurry of scandalized excitement, eager to spread the tale of Sinclair's downfall and Honora's triumph.
Soon the great hall was empty, save for the guttering candles and the lingering scent of wine and beeswax.
Honora stood in the middle of the room, the bronze silk of her dress rustling softly. She was exhausted, drained, but beneath the weariness was a profound sense of peace. The battle was over. Gideon walked towards her, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. The formidable Duke, the stern general, was gone. In his place was the man who had believed her, the man who had orchestrated this entire evening for her sake. "It is done," he said softly. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. "You did not have to do all this." "Yes," he said, his gaze intense. "I did." He stopped before her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The air between them was charged, thick with all the things that had been left unsaid for months. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a steward, not as a problem to be solved, but as Honora. "The contract we signed," he began, his voice low. "The 10-year custodianship. It is no longer sufficient." A familiar fear, cold and sharp, pierced her sense of peace. Of course. Now that the estate was profitable and secure, now that she had served her purpose, he would take it back. She braced herself for the inevitable blow. "I understand, Your Grace. If you wish to amend the terms—" "I wish to abolish them," he said. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were bare, her work-roughened skin a stark contrast to his own smooth, powerful grasp. "The contract does not account for what is now true." He held her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "Honora," he said. The sound of her given name, spoken in his deep voice, was an intimacy more profound than any touch. "I came to Heron Court to settle an account, a piece of property. I thought a home was a collection of walls and a roof. I did not understand what a home truly was until I saw what you have made here, from nothing but your own will and integrity." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "I did not understand what honesty was until I met you. You have rebuilt this house, and in doing so, you have dismantled the fortress I built around myself." Then, to her utter astonishment, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, a man of immense pride and power, went down on one knee before her on the polished floor of the great hall. He still held her hand, his grip now gentle but firm. "The estate is yours," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "By right of conquest, by right of creation. It has always been yours. But I am asking if you will share it with me." Her heart stopped. This was impossible. More impossible than her initial offer to buy the place. "Will you marry me, Honora?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Not for the estate, not as a reward. I am asking you to marry me for myself. Plainly." Plainly. The word he had used when they first met, the demand for unvarnished truth. He was offering her the same now. His own unvarnished heart. Tears she had refused to shed in grief, in anger, or in fear, now welled in her eyes. Tears of a kind she had never known before. They were tears of joy. She looked down at the powerful man kneeling before her, the man who had seen her when no one else had bothered to look, the man who had valued her competence, defended her honor, and now offered her his heart. She thought of her past life, a gray existence of enduring. She looked at her future, a life of choosing, of being chosen. "Yes," she whispered, the single word encompassing everything. He rose to his feet, his face transformed by a slow, rare smile that lit him from within. He drew her forward, into his arms. "Yes," she said again, her voice stronger now, finding his. "Together." And in the quiet, candle-lit hall of the home she had rebuilt, Honora Vickers, finally, truly, came into her own. We'll take a very short break.
If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel.
1 year later, the world of Heron Court had settled into a rhythm of quiet, thriving joy. The autumn sun slanted through the tall windows of the morning room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the warm air. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life. The distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer from the newly built forge, the cheerful chatter of maids in the hallway, the soft murmur of voices from the room where Honora, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, sat beside her husband. She was no longer just Honora Vickers, custodian. She was a wife, a partner, and in 3 months' time, she would be a mother. Her pregnancy had softened the severe lines of her face, bringing a bloom to her cheeks and a serene light to her eyes. She sat at the desk, the very same one from the old steward's office, now moved to this bright, airy room. Before her lay the estate ledgers. They were no longer her solitary burden. Gideon sat beside her, not behind, his shoulder brushing against hers. He pointed to an entry. "The yield from the north pasture is double what it was 2 years ago," he observed, a note of quiet pride in his voice. "Mr. Corbett is a good farmer now that he has good tools," Honora replied, leaning her head against his shoulder for a moment. The ledgers, once a symbol of her lonely struggle, had become a testament to their partnership. They were a weekly ritual, a quiet time for them to connect over the shared project that had brought them together. Their life was woven into these columns of figures, in the cost of a new roof for a tenant, the profit from a good harvest, the budget for the nursery being prepared upstairs. Lady Theodosia Carmichael had become a frequent and cherished guest. She was, at this very moment, walking in the walled garden with Wilf, the two of them engaged in a spirited, grumbling debate about the proper pruning of rose bushes. Wilf, who had once been the Duke's spy, was now Honora's most devoted groundskeeper, his loyalty absolute. Hannah, the once hostile housekeeper, now fussed over Honora relentlessly, knitting tiny garments and preparing nourishing broths, her fierce affection a constant, reassuring presence. As for the Vickers family, their fates had been decided with a justice tempered by mercy. At Honora's request, Gideon had not seen Frederick prosecuted. Instead, the young man had been given a small, one-time allowance and sent to a distant northern town to make his own way, free from the influence of his mother and the temptations of his past. It was a chance at a partial, imperfect redemption. Maud had gone with him, her power broken, her bitterness now a low, constant hum in a life of obscurity. Piers Sinclair had vanished from the county, his name a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower, Gideon asked Honora to walk with him. He led her not to the gardens, but back to the old steward's office, which was now used for storage. It was dusty and quiet. He went to a large oak chest in the corner and lifted the heavy lid. "I was clearing out some of my father's old effects from Kestrel Chase," he said, reaching inside. "And I found this." He brought out a small, velvet-lined box. For a moment, Honora's mind flashed back to that first day, to the heavy purse of coins he had offered her. He placed the box in her hands. It was light. She opened it. Inside, nestled on the dark blue velvet, was not a jewel or a trinket. It was a deed. A heavy piece of parchment, covered in elegant legal script, with a thick wax seal at the bottom. She read the first few lines. It was the deed to Heron Court, and it was signed over in its entirety to one person. Honora Severn, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, in her own right, separate from the ducal estate. She looked up at him, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it left her breathless. "Gideon, why?"
It is ours already. He took her hands, his gaze serious and full of a deep, abiding love. "When I asked you to marry me, I said the estate was yours. I meant it. I do not want you to ever feel that your home is tied to me. It is tied to you. You are the one who gave it life. This," he said, nodding to the deed, "is merely the paperwork catching up to the truth. A partnership of equals begins with equal footing." She looked from the deed in her hands to the face of her husband. He had given her security, a name, a child, a home. But this final act was something more. It was a profound recognition of her, of the woman she had been when she had nothing but her own competence and a desperate, audacious plan. He was not her rescuer. He was her partner, the man who saw her worth and chose every day to stand beside her. She carefully placed the deed back in its box and set it aside. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down for a kiss that was full of gratitude, partnership, and a quiet,
joyful love. The late afternoon light streamed through the dusty window, illuminating them in a golden glow. The house was safe. The land was healing. And in the heart of it all, two people who had once been broken and alone had found in each other a home more sturdy and beautiful than any house made of stone and timber. Together. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.